Hello, my name is Gary Burgess, and welcome to Holding Court, the Jersey Law Podcast. Over the course of this series, we're going to be exploring a number of themes around family law, and to do that, I'm joined by my expert friend, Advocate Rose Colley, partner at Vibert, and a supremo of all things family law. How are you, Rose?
I'm fine, Gary.
I'm delighted to hear it. It feels to me this subject area is so huge that I want to sort of slice and dice a number of different subjects during the course of these episodes. And I want to start by talking about something quite serious and something we think will never happen to us, but actually the statistics say it's something we do need to be aware of, and that is divorce and separation. And this is something you deal with on a daily basis. I guess my silly opener question, and I like a silly question, what is the actual difference between someone getting divorced and someone going through the process of separation?
Okay. I mean, it's not really a silly question because it's something that everyone who's going through a process needs to think about. Divorce is the legal means of ending your marriage. Separation is where you and your wife, husband, come to an agreement. So you agree the finances, you agree anything that needs to be agreed about children, you put it in a document, and then at the end of that process, you then get divorced.
And how do you know which of those effectively paths to take at the outset? Is it pretty obvious that if it's something that feels more acrimonious, it's more likely to be divorce, whereas if both parties are perhaps singing from the same hymn sheet about their relationship, that separation is better? How do you decide which way to go?
I think normally you can tell from the first interview with a client. If it is difficult, acrimonious, often if he or she is feeling particularly hurt, divorce is probably inevitable. If you have a situation whereby the couple are still talking, they want to do things fairly amicably, separation can be the better route, but sometimes it can change, particularly sometimes people start on separation and they think, actually, we've reached a logjam. We're going to need the help very often of the court, and you can only use the court if you've got divorce proceedings.
So is it inevitable that a separation will become a divorce over time?
The answer is 99 times out of 100, yes.
Right. And during the course of that separation process, can you make agreements about how you live your life separately? Could someone, for example, be going on to their next relationship over time? It strikes me that it could feel like a strange limbo that you've agreed this separation, but you're feeling this obligation. There is still a link between you and your ex, effectively.
Yeah, I think some people do find it quite strange and a bit like limbo land, I guess. But the good thing with the separation route is that people are beginning to agree things. So often, if someone does start a new relationship, then that is all seen as part and parcel of the growing apart. Because, of course, because they're still married, technically, the new relationship, I guess, is adultery or unreasonable behaviour within the marriage. So there does need to be a certain amount of understanding.
And as you are dealing with these cases and dealing with these couples, and in many cases, not just couples, because you've got the children and all the other things to think about, what is your role in this? Obviously, you are there as the expert lawyer, but it makes me wonder whether you are also the mediator. I mean, sometimes even the big sister or mum role in some of this.
I think there is a tendency to do that. I think as a family lawyer, you need to be really careful not to get too emotional yourself and not to get too close to the client who will rely on you. And I think the best family lawyers are ones where the client knows they can rely on you, but also rely on you to be quite dispassionate when that needs to be done.
And actually, that's a really important point, isn't it? During the course of this process, it can be very emotional. Those emotions can be heightened for obvious reasons. And to have that dispassionate third party objective rather than subjective view on proceedings could be a huge help.
It can be a huge help, but of course, I can only advise one of them. Um, so often it will depend on who the other lawyer is, whether they take the same view in terms of being close but distant to the client, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to divorce, that for me feels like a much bigger issue, a much bigger life decision. I think the only two phrases I know around divorce are decree nisi and decree absolute, and I'm not fully clear what they mean,
Okay.
other than I feel slightly clever that I can say them out loud. So if we're at the point, regardless of whether we started separation or not, but we're thinking, right, the relationship isn't working, it's time to begin those divorce proceedings. I mean, talk me literally through that process.
Okay.
Would my first step be phone a lawyer?
Well, your first step is that you can only start divorce proceedings in Jersey if you've been married for at least 3 years. So during the first 3 years of marriage, there can be no divorce proceedings.
Can there be separation?
There can be separation. There can also be something which tends to confuse everybody called judicial separation.
And that's where the court intervenes in the separation process.
That's where the court intervenes in the separation process. And judicial separation, there are very, very few cases, but it can be useful where you want to sort out particularly things like maintenance, perhaps difficult issues to do with children, when you haven't been married for 3 years.
So there are options there in that 3 years, but let's for the purposes of this assume we are 3 years or more
Yep.
into our marriage. Sadly, divorce feels like the next best step for us in this relationship breakdown. I Google a good lawyer. Obviously, your name comes up when I do that. I pick up the phone. What happens then?
What happens then is that you would come to see me. And if you were very much of the view that you wanted to start divorce proceedings, then I would explain to you that, again, in Jersey, you have to show what's called a ground for a divorce. You can't just say, as many people, I think, Google and think can be done, oh, the relationship's irretrievably broken down, that's it. You have to show a ground, and the main ones are your husband or your wife has committed adultery. There's something called unreasonable behaviour, which is that the best phrase I was taught many years ago was from an English judgment that said he or she has behaved in a way that goes beyond the normal wear and tear of married life.
Okay. And I guess if you are in a marriage where there isn't an obvious grounds, there isn't the adultery, yet the process demands, there is no such thing as a no-fault divorce.
Not
The
in
process
Jersey,
demands it. The very act of someone declaring and labeling the other
You are
person,
unreasonable.
that surely immediately could escalate the situation.
It could do. Sometimes you're able to agree what are called the facts for the divorce petition. Surprisingly, most people will say, I don't like what you're saying, but I accept it because I think the marriage has broken down. Otherwise, in Jersey, you're going to have to show you've been separated for either a year, if your husband or wife agrees, or 2 years.
So if you are effectively projecting a grounds onto the other, if they don't accept that, there then is a 2-year wait before that becomes effectively agreed and you can move on.
Well, it's a 1 year if you agree. If you don't agree, and it does still happen, then it's a period of 2 years. And so that may mean physical separation. So that leads to all sorts of complicated issues about finances, but you've got no divorce proceedings. So you can't use the court to sort out the finances. You may be arguing about the children, or you can have what's called separation under the same roof. But in fact, that is practically quite difficult because it means you can't do any of the normal things that the average husband or wife would do for their spouse. So clearly you can no longer share a bedroom, but you can't cook for each other, or you can't go out together, you can't socialize together. I couldn't do your washing, you couldn't do my ironing.
So you really do have to be ships that pass in the night to satisfy that rule.
It's
That's
almost
really
like
interesting.
lodgers.
Okay. How long does this process take? And I mentioned decree nisi and decree absolute. I don't quite know what they are. So in this process, decree nisi comes first.
Decree nisi comes first. Decree nisi, normally once you've issued your divorce petition, there's a timetable that's set down by the family court every year, and your decree nisi is the first stage. Now, at the point of the decree nisi, the important thing is that if you've reached a financial settlement, then that can become a final court order at that point. The decree absolute, you have to wait 6 weeks at least before applying for the decree absolute. And at that point, the marriage is at an end.
And all of this relies on agreeing everything before we reach those points. There has to be agreement on both sides. And I know in a future episode of Holding Court, we'll be talking about financial settlements, because that in its own right is a huge subject. But just in broad terms, this process is reliant on both parties finally reaching some kind of satisfactory agreement.
Reaching an agreement, or of course, the court making the decision for you. So only 3 weeks ago, I had a case that went to a 2-day final hearing, and we've just got the judgment. That is quite unusual, but it does happen.
And what's the preference? What's the preference of the court, and what's the preference of you in your experience? Is it better that the couple, through their respective lawyers, can get this agreed so you don't need the court to make those judgments?
Absolutely. Very often it can be useful for the court to intervene at an early stage because the court will set a timetable. And sometimes people do bury their head and think this isn't going to happen. So very often you do need the court timetable. A final hearing, I would say, is probably the least preferred option for anybody. One, it's very expensive. B, you're putting the future of your life in the hands of a judge.
It strikes me during the course of all of this that I can imagine, if I was ever in this situation, that there are character traits of every individual. And for me, perhaps my stubbornness, my wanting to feel satisfied that I've got at least 50% of this side of the deal. I mean, at times, there may be an element of wanting revenge, of wanting to feel like you've really won out of this process, that can make finding that agreement difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's always said that if you reach an agreement, there should be no one really happy and no one really unhappy. The problem is with decisions made by the court is often one person is left very unhappy, and not only unhappy, they've spent often tens of thousands of pounds to a result that they're not happy with, and they've had no control over. And then I think they do look back to the opportunities that they had to try and settle it and think, why didn't I?
And it's funny, it's only at that point,
then
hindsight.
They want to blame their lawyer, usually.
And we want to avoid that completely. Can I be clear, if it does reach that point, is the court's decision final?
The court's decision is final. There's always an opportunity for an appeal, but appeals are quite rare and quite difficult to the Royal Court. And technically, there are appeals from there. In family law, they don't happen very often, mainly because family law, and one of the reasons that family law fascinates me, is it's all what's called discretionary. So it's not like purchasing a house where you go through these steps. with family law, every single case is different, and you can try and predict the outcome, but you may be right or you may be wrong, hopefully not completely wrong. But yeah, you have to like second guess, what do I think a judge would do in this case?
Is there such a thing as a good divorce where the couple arrives, they appreciate they've got their differences because they're getting a divorce, for goodness sake, but every step of the way, they play fair, for want of a better phrase, and it just glides through? Does that happen?
That does happen. And what would I describe as a good divorce? I would, because you also get cases where you know that your client or the spouse on the other side, on the face of it, it's all going through very easily, but you know your client perhaps isn't getting a fair deal. Now, to me, that may be an easy divorce, but it's not a good divorce. I think a good divorce has to be where things can be agreed, but the outcome is an outcome that is fair to both of them and ultimately to the children, and allows them both to move on.
Now let's talk about the children. We've not really spoken about this yet, but as a variable in a divorce, that is a huge variable
huge
with a lot of
factor.
emotion mixed in as well. How does that process work?
Well, I think we're going to talk separately about children, but where there are children within a marriage, then it will make certainly the financial side more complicated. Very often there may be disputes about children as well that will need to be resolved. But in terms of the divorce process, the children are obviously named. There has to be a document called a statement of arrangements about where they're going to be living, where do they go to school, do they have any particular special needs, for example. But the divorce process doesn't really touch the children. The things that affect the children are obviously the bigger picture in terms of who's going to be living where. Can daddy, for example, still afford to pay my school fees? Will I need to move schools? They're the things that really affect children.
And as you say, later in this series, we will explore that in much more detail.
Because it's a big issue.
Absolutely, as is the financial settlement,
Yes.
which we will do separately.
Yes.
But I just want to touch on the finances right now. Again, can that be painless? Is that always torturous? Is it drawn out? How does it work in broad terms?
It can be painless, but it depends on people being completely honest about what they've got. And it depends on people being willing to share, not necessarily, as we'll go on to see, I think in another episode, not necessarily 50-50, but there has to be this willingness to accept that my needs might be different to yours. If the children are living with me, then my needs may be greater than yours, but I've got to recognise that you need to have the children staying with you. You've obviously also got needs to be housed, the children somewhere to sleep when they're with you. So yeah, all of that is important.
Oh, it feels like we've got so much to talk about in this series, which I'm fascinated by. This might sound impertinent. This might sound a bit rude. How much does a divorce actually cost?
Well, the divorce itself, and you need to remember that this is just the mechanism to end the marriage. And people get very confused by adverts, for example, that say, oh, we offer a fixed fee divorce, and they think, can I really get it all done for £1,000, for example? But in terms of the divorce mechanism itself, that would normally cost between £1,000 and £1,500. It's the other bits that tend to add up.
And by other bits, we're talking about
Finances.
toing and throwing over finances, over children, over all those details. And each time
Or
it's
both.
Yes, yes. And each time it's one party to the other party, and this game of tennis almost until you reach an agreement.
It is almost this game of tennis. I'm not particularly keen on this game of tennis in terms of endless correspondence. I think Some lawyers do more of it than I prefer to do. I'm much more trying to, if necessary, get a timetable from the court, which cuts out some of the game of tennis, but also to try and use various methods of, which again I think we'd talk about in another interview, what's called financial dispute resolution, sort of mediation-ish, which can be of a variety of sorts.
And it feels like it's all designed to take the heat or the sting out of this so that there can be a more rational conversation.
Hopefully, although I have had occasions, for example, I remember this was a few years ago now, one settlement meeting where the husband, who I wasn't representing, threw his laptop on the floor and swore at his lawyer and walked out. So sometimes, again, even when you're trying to settle things, people just can't get their heads around it because in their mind, it isn't fair.
And that is a theme I found coming out of this, is that both sides will inevitably feel like that, because if you've reached a just outcome, there has to have been give and take for that to work fairly.
It does, and there needs to be this recognition, which, again, I try and tell clients quite early on, that the law says there can be no discrimination between your role earning the money and your role bringing up the children.
Is divorce the end of the story? Is that it? We've got divorced, game over, move on, never need to see a lawyer in my life, and we don't have to worry about this. We only look forwards. Or do you find there is a shadow cast by that divorce process?
Often there will be a shadow cast. I mean, I've had many cases where a financial settlement is agreed and things change, particularly vis-a-vis children getting older, or someone might lose their job, or all sorts of things might happen where they come back and want to alter the arrangement. Bits of it they can alter, some of it they can't in law. But it tends to be children and not being able to agree about children. So there might need to be another hearing or an application certainly filed where there's a dispute about what school does little Johnny go to. So I've had cases where the dispute has been, should they go to Vic College or Grainville, or should they go to, it wasn't Eton, but the equivalent.
Goodness. The story does not end with that process, but that is life as well, isn't it?
That's life as well.
Right, we'll talk much more about some of these themes in future episodes. I want to wrap up for now as we introduce the idea of divorce and separation. Really, if I could get 3 top tips from you, Rose, and you could probably give me 1,000, but 3 top tips if I feel like this process is on the horizon for me in my relationship as I go into it, what would your best advice be?
I think the first bit of advice is to be absolutely sure that divorce is inevitable and that there's no way that the marriage can be helped over a difficult period, because sometimes that can happen. So I think that's the number 1 tip. I think the number 2 tip is to try and realize quite early on that in virtually all cases, it's all about meeting what's called meeting need, your need, his or her need, the children's needs. And it's not about who brought what into the marriage, which is often a fallacy that some people carry around with them. And I think the third thing is to, as difficult as it is, to try and remain as dispassionate as possible. And I always say to clients, think through this carefully, because what you agree today is potentially going to affect the rest of your life. And that's particularly on the financial side, but it can also be in relation to children as well.
Really, really good advice. Rose, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Gary.
Advocate Rose Colley, family law expert and partner at Vibus. And join us next time as we're holding court yet again, talking financial settlements.